Hello and welcome along. So today we're going to talk about the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons are the 15th Legion. We're going to look at their time before they were reunited with their Primarch Magnus. So this continues the series I've been doing on Legions before meeting their Primarchs. If you haven't seen the others, please go and watch them. I think they're pretty good. Hopefully you do too. So the Thousand Sons are quite different in their formative years, let's say, to many of the other legions. So often you'll find when you look at the legion histories, you find that the legions are generally recruited from people that have had pretty terrible lives. So they're either prisoners or they're barbarians. They're in some cases with the Blood Angels actual mutants. People that are living on the edges of society, the downtrodden, the people that have had incredibly difficult lives, and therefore the idea is that the ones that survived are incredibly impressive, and therefore the best candidates to use for turning into Astartes. Now, but with the Thousand Sons, that's not the case. So the Thousand Sons were recruited from the area of Old Terra known as the Achaemenid Empire. So this was an era of terror where the emperor had actually been ruling for some time, probably something like a century. So it was very stable and, let's face it, a nice place to live compared to the rest of Terra, or at least most parts of Terra, which were destroyed by huge environmental disasters, massive and unending wars, and were ruled by the worst kind of tyrant who abused their citizens and used them as slaves, essentially. There was terrible things were going across all Terra. And you can argue, well, the emperor in a way he is also a tyrant of sorts, but he was the best amongst a very bad bunch in most cases on Old Terra. And so, if you were living in this area, you had a pretty decent life compared to most other people on the planet. And so the recruits that were drawn into Thousand Sons weren't these, they hadn't lived extreme lives where they have proven themselves as survivors because of how they were the only ones that survived. They were living more normal lives, and they were picked out as basically the best candidates based on their families and so on that the emperor thought would make good genetic candidates for being Astartes. So he looked at them quite closely himself, at least that seems to be the case, but it really kind of decided on merit rather than on what conditions they'd been through to get to that point. So, for example, with the Night Lords, they were picked from the prison population of Old Albia, and they weren't picked out as individuals as such, like, this guy's got a genetic heritage, he should be an Astarte. It was just like, well, if you manage to survive that, then you probably do. So we'll recruit you, and if you survive the process, then we were obviously right. But with the Thousand Sons, it was more specific, more deliberate, and like, okay, this family looks like they've got a good genetic heritage. We think they will make a good pool to draw Astartes from. So the sons that were young enough to be recruited would then be taken into the legions, or the legion in the Thousand Sons. Now, another difference with the Thousand Sons is when they were first raised, there was this big son of warp surge of energy that basically caused a massive problem across Terra. So huge kind of spontaneous outbreaks of violence were occurring at this time. And now this isn't generally, it's not like the blame isn't put on to the Legion, because no one really makes that connection, and it doesn't seem to have had any effect on the Legion. It's not supposed to have, at least, but it did happen, and it's generally seen, and I think Magnus is supposed to have said that there's kind of a bad sign basically of what's to come. Now, whether the Emperor thought about this at the time and he thought that this was a bad sign, or he just considered it one of those random events that happens with the warp, I don't know. There's no real evidence of anything there, but it is important to say that it did happen, and it could have had some effect on the Legion. We just don't know. Perhaps this was the start of the problems that the Legion would have with the flesh change, which we'll talk about more soon. Maybe that was the Chaos Gods intervening to affect the Legion, curse them in some sense. But there's no one saying that that's the case. So that's just supposition. So another big difference with the Legion is that they seem to have been created relatively late in the Unification Wars, and so there wasn't much left for them to do. So when they were created, they didn't have much work to do on Terra to actually defeat the enemies of the Emperor and bring about unification. That was essentially done. And so they just got a little sort of token job of cleaning up some last remaining techno-barbarians who were in isolated spots, just to prove that they were ready for the job, basically, that they functioned as a legion. And as soon as they'd done this, they proved themselves. They were given their own expeditionary fleet and sent off into space as part of the Great Crusade. So their history of actually fighting on Terra or even within the solar system doesn't seem to be very extensive at all, which is again quite different to a lot of the Legion. Now, another interesting point about the Thousand Sons is their name itself. So it's long been said in the lore, as far as I was always aware, that that Magnus named them the Thousand Sons when he was reunited with them, because that's all that was left of them. Again, which we'll get to in a second. When they were reunited, so there's about 1,000 of them, and then of course one of these kind of portents of the future type situation happens, where after the burning of Prospero, there's also only 1,000 of them left, and so there's that kind of is one is kind of it's this kind of circular nature of events in the 40k world, and this connection with things always being planned out or kind of always happening how they should and that kind of thing. So you get the Thousand Sons named the Thousand Sons because there's only 1,000 of them left when they reunite with Magnus, but then they also are brought back down to around 1,000 when they become a traitor legion. So it's kind of like serendipitous. The reason I bring this up is because what I've been reading is, in fact, that the Emperor named them the Thousand Sons after they had proved themselves on Terra, which doesn't really make any sense, because why would they be called the Thousand Sons? That name, well, first of all, the Emperor generally didn't name any of the legions. There was a couple I think he may have, but generally the legions didn't get names. They were just known by their number, so they should have really just been known as the 15th Legion. Secondly, it's just an odd name to pick. It makes sense with the Magnus story. It doesn't make sense with the Emperor being the person that named them, because there's no reason to call them that. So unless you could say, well, maybe he picked 1,000 sons from these families, important families of the region of Terra that he was ruling, and he thought, I'm going to call them the Thousand Sons because they're the starting 1,000. You could say that, but there's no story of that. That's described like that, so that's kind of just guesswork. So, but I would probably stick with the idea that Magnus names them. Like in most cases, you'll find the legion's name comes from their Primarch. When they meet them, they decide to call them something. So that makes more sense to me. So the character of the Thousand Sons is quite different from a lot of the other legions, and I think we all know that they are very much focused on acquiring knowledge. They're generally much more reasonable people than the other legions. Many of the other legions, at least, they tend not to be prone to rapid decisions or violence. They're much more likely to be inclined to listening to a potential enemy and deciding if that enemy can be persuaded to come round to their way of thinking and be brought onto the side, rather than, as you know, with many of the legions, the instant there's a sign of resistance from, well, I'm going to say an enemy, but they're not even an enemy at this point, from some population, their first reaction is always violence. Now, there's some, obviously that varies amongst the legions, but it is definitely a trend. With the Thousand Sons are like right on the other edge of that trend. They're the ones that are most least likely to attack you, even if you argue with them. Even if you say, no, we're not going to join the Empire, we don't think this is a good thing, then they're the least likely to do it, and they will find other ways of bringing you into compliance. Now, during the early parts of the Great Crusade, before they were reunited with Magnus, they generally used a lot more diplomacy, a lot more deception, even in some ways, to bring populations under compliance, so without having to kill them. So they would use negotiation, but they would also do things in the background to manipulate, to lead a population down the path to compliance, even if they were initially resistant to it. Now, they would use their psychic abilities as well at this stage, although at that time the psychic abilities were different to what they would be when they were reunited with Magnus, because he introduced a whole school of psychic training, which he developed on Prospero with the people there. So at this time, the Legion didn't have any of that, so they didn't have the various cults that became famous pre-heresy and heresy period under Magnus. So at this time, they had psychic abilities, but they weren't as defined about how, in terms of what they were and why they would be used in certain situations. So they used these abilities to help bring populations into compliance. And if they were human populations, for example, that weren't that heavily resistant, they would use that to kind of persuade them, essentially. Maybe alter people's emotional states, maybe give them suggestions, maybe get, if a particular leader was a particularly difficult person, get them to say something that might get them to be less well liked or followed. These kind of things, the subtle arts of manipulation to bring a population into compliance without having to kill them all, or even having to kill any of them sometimes. This, though, did lead to quite a lot of suspicion and dislike from other legions, particularly other Primarchs. Obviously, there are famously Leman Russ does not like the Thousand Sons and very suspicious of them. Mortarion hates all Psykers, so he had a very low opinion of them. But there was a general feeling of discomfort with the legion of Psykers, or large numbers of Psykers, because the Empire is generally anti-Psyker. Is one of the great contradictions of the Imperium. It's led by an incredibly powerful Psyker, second in charge, incredibly powerful Psyker, uses various Psykers to do obviously very important tasks that keep it functioning, like astropaths and navigators. But at the same time, there's this deep distrust and hatred even for Psykers. So then if you've got this legion that has an unusually high number of Psykers. In fact, probably at this time, probably the only legion with active Psykers, because the other legions didn't really start using Psykers till the Librarius was founded, and that didn't happen until considerably later. So you would imagine that this would immediately cause suspicion amongst both the other legions and the general population of the Imperium. And so it would be very difficult for the Thousand Sons to get people's trust when they're using these otherworldly powers that, up to this point, only the Emperor and Malcador would be considered trustworthy enough to be able to use these powers, except for in the very specific and controlled circumstances of astropaths and navigators. So then maybe the Legion was kind of sent away with their own expeditionary fleet quite early, and not used on Terra much in the early days, because the Emperor didn't really want them around to other people of the general population of the Imperium, particularly higher up, more influential people, really seeing them in action or knowing much about them. And perhaps that's why they were sent away, rather than there just wasn't much for them to do. So as the Great Crusade continued on, the Thousand Sons would come into contact with more and more difficult enemies to deal with. So enemies where they weren't just, random populations of humans who had been abandoned out in the planet somewhere and needed to be brought back into the Imperium. These were aliens. These were people, more developed societies where they were much more resistant. These were also societies that had their own Psykers in some cases. And so they had to start using their powers more directly, and they would use their powers in a more militaristic way, so destructive abilities. Again, not in the same way that they would under Magnus, where they were very clearly focused and trained to do specific types of psychic abilities with the various cults of the Thousand Sons. At this point, it would have been more like, well, what can you do as an individual? And if you can do it and it works, well, then that's fine. But they would have used more things like blasts of psychic energy and creating fires and literally telekinetic abilities like smashing someone with an invisible hand, these kind of things. These are just natural kind of things that Psykers seem to do when they aren't trained. So they could use these kind of more direct attacks against these enemies that were more difficult to manipulate or bring on side through diplomacy. But this still didn't really satisfy the Primarchs that didn't like them, and this would just prove the point more that they were dangerous, because they were using these powers that our enemies would use. So that still didn't look good, and still kept them on the edge and under suspicion all the time. Now, they did have, though, considerable success. They didn't suffer any major defeats. They didn't struggle to bring planets into compliance. They actually did well at this, and even though they weren't being fully trusted, maybe were under some suspicion, they still went out, did their job, and were successful as a legion. They just did things differently to the others. Now, eventually, though, they did start to have problems. And now the famous thing about the Thousand Sons is, of course, the flesh change. So the flesh change is basically, it's a spontaneous mutation that goes out of control and turns someone into a chaos spawn. Now, they didn't understand the concept of chaos spawn at this time, but they just knew that this thing happened where someone would just start getting these kind of symptoms of sort of rapid mutation that would happen, and it would run out of control, and the person would be lost to into a monstrous sort of flesh creature that had to be put down. And so what they started to do once they realized this thing wasn't going to just be a one-off, is they started to put people into stasis when this started to happen. They see the first symptoms, they put the person into stasis, and then on the hope that one day they could come up with a cure. Now they kept trying for the cure. Of course, they couldn't find one, but this kept happening, and it kept happening more and more often. And the more and more often it happened, obviously, the less and less of them were available. So they didn't necessarily die because they were being seen relatively early and put into stasis, so they could be preserved. Although it did kill a fair number of them, but they ended up putting so many into stasis, and so many being lost, that they were down to around 1,000 Astartes when they finally were reunited with Magnus, when Prospero was found. And so at this point, the Legion is on a spiral down. It's going to basically go extinct. So Magnus is reunited with them, and he basically, as we all know, has to come up with a way of saving the Legion. Otherwise, there isn't any Legion for him to command. It's also another little bit of a weird one here, where when the Legion are reunited with Magnus, the Emperor doesn't take Magnus away, and he doesn't. A lot of the other Primarchs, in fact, I think almost entirely all of them, when they were first found, were basically taken away by the Emperor and given training, sort of mentorship, often by either him or Malcador or another Primarch. So the early Primarchs were mentored by the Emperor Malcador, then the later ones that were found were mentored by the older ones. Well, older is subjective, we'll see. It's just older in terms of being around longer in the Emperor's presence. They weren't older, physically older. So in Magnus's case, he's left on Prospero, and basically with the Legion, basically it's like, well, we're here now. Okay, this is the situation, but because Magnus has already been talking to the Emperor through the warp, so they were actually very familiar. So, which is different, again, completely different to the other Primarchs, and so he doesn't take him away. He just leaves the Legion there with him and goes off. It's like, here's 1,000 guys, and then a few more thousand in stasis. By the way, they're probably all going to die. Bye, and then he goes. Magnus obviously has to fix this, so he makes this pact with Tzeentch without really knowing that he is doing that, and then that leads to all of the various problems in the future, which we don't need to go into here because that's not what this is about. But he is kind of forced into doing that, and why you come down on that is obviously down to you. So, but what does this say about the Legion, or what effect does this have on the Legion, their character? So, unlike a lot of the Legions who turned up to their Primarch in good condition with large numbers, the Thousand Sons turn up basically on the edge of destruction, and everything they are is now owed to Magnus because he saves them, and that obviously would have an effect on the culture of the Legion. It also means that most of the recruits who were recruited on Terra are either dead or incapacitated. The culture of the Terran core of the Legion is going to have less influence than the culture of the planet that the Primarch is found on, in this case Prospero, whereas some of the other Legions, there's a lot more Terran recruits that survived up to the point of contact with their Primarch, and so that leads to more of a division, I think, between the Terrans and the natives of the population that the Primarch has grown up with. And you see this with all the other Legions having problems with this division. You don't really get that in the Thousands at all. There's no really division between the Terrans and the Prosperans, is that what you call someone from Prospero? And also interesting with the Thousand Sons is that kind of Terran culture issue that, as we said, other Legions have. Often you find that the Primarchs favour the legionaries that come from their own homeworlds. And usually the leader, sort of the second in charge, or the senior, and a lot of the senior officers of a legion are, by the time of the heresy, all from their Primarch's home worlds, which with the Thousand Sons isn't the case really. Well, it's not entirely the case because, of course, Ahriman as that Karaman, is chief librarian, but also in effect first captain of the Thousand Sons, and at the time of the heresy. And he was recruited on Terra as one of the very first recruits. So he basically, we don't know if he led the Legion at this point, but because he's not considered the Legion master. Come from all the way through from he's experienced almost the entirety of the Legion's history, and usually you'll find that Primarchs find a way of getting their man in charge. So someone that was very close to them when they were growing up usually ends up as the second in charge of their legion. Now, I think it's interesting to think about why the Thousand Sons were created by the Emperor. What we know that generally he's got some idea, some purpose behind each legion he creates, and often when they seem to be like the legion might be a mistake in some sense, you can look at the history of the legion and you can see that they were created to do a specific job by the Emperor, and that's what he wanted, even though it might seem like they went off the rails, they didn't really. And then, although obviously eventually some of them did because they became traitor legions, they were doing things before they were traitors that you might look at and think, well, that's obviously them failing, but actually that was just them doing the job the Emperor wanted them to do. The Night Lords being a very good example of that. The World Eaters, another one. So with the Thousand Sons, it's clear that he wanted to create a psychic legion because he picked the individual candidates himself from the families that he had selected. He picked people with high psychic potential. He used the gene seed of an incredibly potent psyker to create them, and he obviously wanted these legionaries to be psykers. It's said that he only reluctantly tolerated this development of psychic abilities, and that he was generally uncomfortable with it. But of course, that's clearly not true. I mean, he might have presented that to other people. Like, it's a bit. I know. I didn't expect this, but they are quite useful. So maybe we'll just tolerate it for now. We'll keep a good eye on them, though. Don't worry. When obviously, what really happened is he specifically set out to create a legion of as many psychics as possible because he knew it would be useful to him. Perhaps he was thinking into the future, where you think, well, this would be a useful weapon against chaos. Or he was just thinking, well, this will be a useful weapon in conquering the various populations that have high numbers of psychers that I'm going to come up against when we go out on the Great Crusade. Whatever it was, he obviously was part of his plan and was something that he definitely intended. Now, another interesting thing is when the Legion is dropped off with Magnus on Prospero, and the Emperor goes, suddenly the rate of mutation of the flesh change suddenly increases. So it's almost like the Emperor was controlling it to some level and repressing it in some way, using his psychic abilities to do that. Now, again, that's no evidence that this is definitely the case, but it does seem a bit suspicious. And it's almost like the Emperor was just like, well, I've had to put up with this burden of holding back this flesh change. Now it's your turn, and just leaves them there. Now, what does he expect to happen is another question. What does he think is going to happen when he drops them off on Prospero? Maybe by now he's given up on them and he's like, well, at least they're all in one spot. Then I don't have to deal with it. And maybe he doesn't expect Magnus to be able to correct it, and that they'll just basically go extinct on Prospero, and he doesn't have to worry about the problem anymore. And he's got this plan for Magnus to put him into the Golden Throne. At least that's again not 100% confirmed, but it seems pretty obvious, and it's I think you can say it's 99% true that was his plan, to use Magnus in the Golden Throne. Now, maybe he's like, well, I don't need that yet because it's going to be a lot, way into the future when I'm ready to start to get to that point, because he's got to basically repair it and explore the webway project, etc., before that becomes an issue. So he could drop off the Thousand Sons. They've been useful up to this point, but now they've become too much of a problem with the flesh change. They all die off, and then in the future he'll come and get Magnus when he needs him and take him back for to on Earth, where he can put him on the throne, on the Golden Throne. Now, maybe that was his plan. That's an interesting idea to explore, I think. Or maybe it's just the Emperor knew that Magnus would find a way, and that would be useful for him for like 100 years or so of having this incredibly powerful and effective legion that Magnus would create for him. And the fact that eventually it would lead to issues because Magnus would have to step across the line to do it. Maybe the Emperor calculated that was necessary, because again, he does tend to do that. and maybe he was setting Magnus up for a fall all along. But that doesn't seem the case as well, because he does seem to generally be disappointed and surprised by Magnus damaging the Webway project when he bursts into the throne room through the Webway portal. He doesn't seem to expect that to happen in any way, so I don't think he's planned it that much. It seems more like he just took the risk of it and thought, well, this will be useful 100 years later. I can worry about the issue or the problems then. He does tend to do that as well. So yeah, let me know what you think. How much did the Emperor really know what was going on with the flesh change? How much did he expect Magnus to be able to fix it? Did he really think this stuff through? Why was he spending so much time talking to Magnus in the warp before he found Magnus, and then very little afterwards? It does feel like he basically abandoned Magnus, and maybe that's again because he started to know that what would go on in the future was going to be bad for Magnus, and he just kind of distanced himself from him because of that. Who knows? Let me know what you think. Great to hear your comments. Keep them up, and of course, like and subscribe, share if you can, and let's keep growing the channel. Thank you very much. I will see you next time.